Welcome to the Introduction to Measure Properties, Part 3. In this lesson, we'll continue reviewing the Measure Properties panels. This video covers the Component Class option in the Configuration panel. We discussed the concept of normal form and long form measures in the measure theory lessons, but a brief review might be helpful. Component class is the term we use to describe the relationship between denominator and numerator observations. Normal form measures have at most one numerator record for every denominator record. So there is at most a one-to-one relationship between denominator and numerator observations. Long form measures, on the other hand, can have multiple numerator records for each denominator record. These measures can have a one-to-many relationship between the denominator and numerator observations. This measure, ED visit following hospital discharge, is a normal form measure. It's likely that most measures you'll build will be of this component class. The template we used to create this measure expected it to be a normal form measure, as evidenced by the specification of the event n ordinality option. This is the option where we were able to choose the first, second, third, or last instance of an ED visit within 14 days. If you remember our review of the numerator-denominator relationship panel in the numerator stack, we reviewed the restrictions that ensure the measure would adhere to the normal form structure, where each denominator observation has at most one numerator observation. The keep nth following reference date pattern specifies that we keep the first instance of an ED visit following discharge. As it's certainly possible that there may be multiple ED visits within 14 days of discharge, this restriction limits the number of those instances of ED visits to only one, which, as I mentioned, ensures this measure maintains a normal form component class. If we wanted to create a slightly different measure, one that provides the count of ED visits following discharge, this would be a long form measure. The potentially one-to-many relationship between denominator and numerator observations would be needed to count the number of visits. Let me show you how to clone this measure so that we can make this change as a means of exploring the slightly different configurations needed for long-form measures. So first, we'll select this icon that looks like two documents to clone the measure. Then you'll see that the name of the cloned measure is prefixed with the word cloned in brackets. Normally, we would want to change the name of the measure and update the details in the naming panel, but for our purposes today, we'll focus on the topic at hand. To update our cloned measure so that it reports the count of ED visits following discharge, there are several panels that need to be updated. First, there are three fields that need to be addressed that are specific to long-form measures. In the configuration panel, when we change the component class from normal form to long form, two of these three fields appear in the panel. The numerator ranking field allows you to select which numerator field to sort the numerator observations on. In this case, we'll use the numerator ED visit start date. The numerator ranking direction field enables you to specify the direction of the sort, whether ascending or descending. These two fields impact how data is displayed in Analytics Portal's case review. The third of these three fields is in the numerator and denominator contributions panel. When we open this panel, we first want to ensure that the numerator contribution is appropriate for our new measure, that it's counting the number of ED visits within 14 days of discharge. Then, we need to select an aggregate function for calculating numerator observations. The case is null pattern, which calculates if a numerator encounter ID is null, then 1, else 0, is still the right pattern for our new measure. Now we specify the numerator component aggregation function, which is the third of the long-form fields that we're discussing. In this case, the appropriate option is sum. This will effectively serve as a mechanism for totaling the number of ED visits. Now let's make a couple of other updates to finish specifying the measure. In the Measure Metadata panel, we'll change our measure distribution to normal and our measure unit to number. Next, we'll remove the keep nth following reference state restriction that we just discussed in the numerator-denominator relationship panel. This will remove that restriction that limits each denominator observation to at most one numerator observation. So we just covered a lot of ground and we jumped into some panels that we have not yet reviewed. We'll cover each of those panels in more detail as we move forward. But to summarize, there are three specific fields that are germane to long-form measures. First, long-form measures need a numerator ranking field specified. This field determines how numerator observations will be sorted when there are more than one. Second, you can specify the numerator ranking direction. This determines the direction of the ranking field's sort, whether ascending or descending. Third, the numerator component aggregation function field in the numerator and denominator contributions panel needs to be specified as well. This field determines the aggregate function to be used when a denominator observation is associated with multiple numerator observations. We'll pause here for this lesson. Thank you for taking the time to review it. And when thinking of a measure's component class, as a rule of thumb, remember that normal form measures have a one-to-one relationship between denominator and numerator observations, whereas long-form measures have a one-to-many relationship between the denominator and numerator observations.